Hi everyone. So many of you probably recognize this game, the world's hardest game. It's really kind of a simple game. You just have a player shape that's trying to not get hit by a bunch of other shapes, and you're trying to get from one end of a maze to the other. Well, this is what we're going to work on making in Scratch, something similar to this. So let me show you what it looks like in Scratch. Here's my Scratch version. You'll notice it looks slightly different, but the idea is still the same. You have a player sprite that's trying to not run into some other object sprites. If you do, it goes back to the beginning. It counts how many times you fail, and it counts what level you're on. So that's what this activity is going to be. And it's going to give you an opportunity to try out different kinds of key controls for the player, different kinds of motion for non-player sprites, and also sensing whether or not something's touched a color, because that might come in handy later for a project at some point. So let's go ahead and make our own version of that. So one of the first things I'm going to need to do is, I think instead of using a sprite for this, you could use a sprite for this, but I'm actually going to create a backdrop for the stage. So if I click on the stage over on the right side and the bottom, instead of clicking on a sprite, I'm clicking on the stage. And instead of picking a backdrop from the options that they have, I'm actually going to draw my own. So I clicked on backdrops. You can see there are all these different tabs. One of them is backdrops, and you have the option of just drawing your own backdrop, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to select the line, and then I'll pick a color. I think I'll have blue lines, just like in my example. And I want them to be pretty thick because you're going to need to be able to sense that you collided with them. So that's why I chose a pretty large thickness for my lines. And then I'm just going to draw some sort of stage area where the game can happen. I kind of had a little safe zone at the beginning, and then just a big box. With a safe zone at the end. And one thing you might want to make sure of is just that your lines are actually straight on the top and bottom. This will matter later when we make things bounce. So one thing you could do is just select everything. If you see lines that are, sorry, I'm actually going to use this selector, the reshape selector over here. And if you see things that, like, I think my bottom line is a little crooked, so I'm just going to drag. Oops. I'm just going to click this point here. So it's kind of odd, but what I'm going to have to do if I'm reshaping is pay attention to whether or not the corner that I'm moving is filled in. Right now, if this corner is dark blue instead of white, looks like I can move it around, but some of the corner, I don't know. It's really odd because, like, before, if I tried to move this corner, it wouldn't let me, and then I clicked on a different corner and it let me move this corner. I'm not really sure. Try clicking the different corners until it lets you drag them around. To be honest, it is kind of confusing. But like, I wanted to just straighten this out, and then I kind of want to expand this a little bit to make it a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to drag these corners out as well. It's not a huge deal if you just scrap the whole thing and redraw also. I mean, it really didn't take that long to draw it in the first place, so if there really is something wrong, you can always just draw a new one. Anyway, I resized mine. If you need to, that's how you do it, is by using this selector and then choosing the corners if it lets you. It is a little bit finicky. So once you've got your backdrop, the next thing is going to be a new sprite. I'm just going to get rid of the cat. And then I'll hover over choose a sprite, and I will choose paint. I'll just paint a new sprite. And all I want my character to be is just some sort of shape. I'll just make it a circle. You could make it like the, if you want it to be like the original, I think it might have been a rectangle. Doesn't particularly matter. I guess, yeah, let's make it a rectangle. It actually makes some things more straightforward if you do that. The sensing, I think, is a little bit better when it crashes into stuff. So what you need to do when you make a shape is pay attention to the fill and the outline. So in this case, I don't want an outline at all. If there is an outline, let's see, I think I want this to be green. If there's an outline, like, notice it just draws the outer edge of the shape. I mean, you can do that and you could fill it in. Really, I don't want an outline at all. I really just want the fill. I just want it to be a solid shape. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'll set the fill color and make sure it's the right size. Make sure it's the size that I need and the shape that I need. I think I might need it to be a little bit smaller. Alright. And make sure it's centered as well. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Make sure it's centered. If it isn't centered, then you're going to have weird situations when you go to move it and rotate it and turn and things like that. It might rotate around the center point, and if it's not in the center point, that means it just kind of moves around. So make sure your drawing is centered. Just drag it to that center spot. And okay, now I've got a sprite that will be our player sprite. And all I want to do for movement is keyboard controls. So what I'll do is forever if I'm going to use W, A, S, and D. It's kind of like it's one of the industry standards for up, down, left, right. You can also use the arrow keys. I prefer WASD, but that's just my own personal preference. If you want to use arrow keys, that's fine, or any other keys for that matter, but usually, most of the time in gaming, people use either WASD or arrow keys. So what I'll do is I'll have W for up, and in this case, in the past, changing X or changing Y directly has been the easiest way to do it. However, the direction is really going to matter in this program, and you'll see what I mean by that later. But in order to get this blue outline of the stage of the map that you're working on to actually contain your player sprite, you're going to have to do some tricks with the direction. So you actually have to move using the direction. It is important that you do it this way instead of change X and change Y. Actually, when I was setting up my own example of this, I started by doing change X and change Y because it was easier, but it ended up failing, and I had to redesign it because of that exact reason. Direction is going to end up mattering later. So what I'm going to do is, instead of doing change X, change Y, I'm going to make it point in a direction and move. So I'll get a move block. I'll have it point in direction for up. Just point the arrow up. So it's just going to point and move. And so if I run it, you should see it moves. It looked like it moved kind of fast. I'm going to dial it back just a little bit. I'm going to try 7. It seems a little better. And then I can just copy this a bunch of times and make some changes. So down is going to be the S key. And with the arrow pointed down, left will be my A key. With the arrow pointed to the left, that's -90. And D will be the direction right, direction 90. So now if I move, now I can move up, down, left, and right using the arrow keys. So now that I can do that, one problem that you're going to notice is that it just goes everywhere, and there's supposed to be kind of like an obstacle course here, but I mean, you could imagine if there were obstacles in the way somewhere in the middle, you could just leave the map and just go around. So we need to lock the player into the map. So first of all, I want to see where I want my player to start. I want my player to start here. Looks like -170, -79. Great. That's going to be the starting point for the player sprite when the game starts. And then this is kind of a safe zone where you're not going to get hit by any obstacles, and so is this other corner. Gotta make sure they're big enough for the player sprite to fit into, because the next thing we're going to do is make it so that you can't leave the blue. The blue walls will be something the player sprite can't go through. So if there might not even be enough space in my example, I might need to resize this. If there isn't enough space for your player sprite to fit, you need to either make the player sprite smaller or make the corner bigger. Because what's going to happen is you won't be able to leave that blue area. And here's how that'll be set up. We're going to use if the sprite is touching a color. So in sensing, there's this touching color block. If you grab a touching color block and click on the color, you can actually, don't even try to guess what the color is. It has to be exact. It has to be 100% exact for this to work. So what you should do is just click this eyedropper thing, and then click on the actual color. Click on right in the middle of it. It's weird because the edges are sometimes like gray. Don't click the edge. Don't click the middle. Make sure it's actually highlighting the boldest color, the main color, which in this case is like that bright blue. Click on that. And so now, if the sprite is touching the color, that exact shade of blue, what I want it to do is kind of bounce off of it just a little bit. Not so much that it's really noticeably bouncing, but just so that it doesn't cross over. So I want it to point in the opposite direction of where it's pointing, which in this case is always going to be its current direction. So we get a plus sign, because we're going to add a couple things together. One is the current direction, which is this blue motion block that just says direction. So it's, oops, that was not what I wanted to do. Its current direction plus 180, right? Because it'll just be 180 degrees from wherever it is. If it's pointing up, that's 0, then it's going to flip over to 180. It's going to point down. If it was pointing to the right, it's going to add 180, so it'll be 270. Remember, Scratch can handle 270. Scratch can handle numbers bigger than 180. It just translates them for you. If I type in 270, notice it just translates that to -90, which is left. It's perfect because if it went from 90 to 270 by adding 180, it goes from right to left. That's what we want. We want the opposite direction. So it points in the opposite direction, then moves just a little bit. 10 steps, is that enough? Let's find out. I'm just going to run it. What happens if I move? If I try to go over the blue, it just gets stuck. It's kind of bouncing a little. At least it fits down here. And notice it's kind of glitching. I think it's like maybe bouncing a little too much, and there might not be enough room to move. So I'm going to do two things to fix that. I'm going to fix this backdrop by just making it a little bit bigger. See how it's moving around again? I just clicked on the corner again and it worked fine. and mine kind of looks a little bit crooked, so I'm just going to make some slight adjustments, hopefully make it not crooked. Okay, I think this should work fine. Because I changed the shape of this, I might need to reposition where the starting point is. Could back in my code for the sprite. Looks like I want my starting position to be more like -158, -69. Alright, so keep in mind when you're hard coding exact locations of things, you're saying just go to a specific spot. If you change the shape and size and positioning of stuff, you might have to you might have to make some adjustments to those coordinates. That's what I just had to do. So now let's see, if I run into the edge, it just bounces off. It seems fine. It's kind of bouncing a lot. Maybe just moving 5 steps. Let's see how that works. I also want to make sure it's actually effective. So if it doesn't, 5 steps might not be enough to get it off. See how it's like kind of forcing its way through. It's not good enough. So let me try 8 steps or 7 steps. Let me try 7 steps. Because 7 steps is pretty good because 7 steps is the actual number of steps that it's taking when it moves. So it moves and touches something blue. Well, it just moves back 7 steps, which is exactly how far it moved to get there in the first place. So it kind of just stops dead. So I think 7 is a really good choice, although it looks like it can kind of get hung up a little. Yeah, it's not perfect. What about 8? Just a little bit farther. It's also possible that this is just Scratch and it's not everything is going to be 100% perfect. Backing off by 8 seems it's not quite as aggressive as a bounce, and it doesn't let you go through. Maybe this is fine. One of those things where you kind of just have to use trial and error. Either way, it is stopping. It's not letting you go through the blue walls. So that's kind of the point. Time to move on. Another thing I'm going to need is I'll need some obstacles. So I'm going to also hover over choose a sprite and click on the paintbrush. And I'll draw, I think I'm going to have sort of like kind of windmill things for my first set of obstacles. And I would like them to be red. So I'm going to choose red. Outline should be fine here because it is just a line. And I'll just move this so it's centered. Alright, so looks like this windmill is a little large. I can always just shrink it using the size property, make it a little bit smaller. I mean, I do want it to cover a lot of the map so that you can't just sneak through, but I also don't want it to be outrageously big. That seems about right. And in the code, what I want it to do for now is to just spin. So when the game starts, I'm just going to have it forever turn 15 degrees, and that's way too fast. Let's slow it way down. I'm going to try 1 degree. That seems better. So now I've got a spinning windmill thing. And what I can do is just right click on it and duplicate it. So I have 2 spinning windmill things. And I think for the other one, the one difference that I want to set up is I want it to spin the other way. So I'll use turn to the left instead. Now when I run it, I have two spinny windmill things. They're not exactly symmetrical, and if you're really picky about that, you can always fine-tune things, but I'm just going to leave it alone because the game will work fine, just as it is.